Hi, my name is Soo-Young Lee, and in this recording, I'll be presenting about a research paper titled Preventing Lunchtime Attacks, Fighting Insider Threats with Eye Movement Biometrics. Before I continue with the presentation, I'd like to give acknowledgments to the authors of the research paper, and I also included the link to the research paper if you choose to read more about the paper and its findings. Here's the agenda of the presentation. I will be going over the general overview of the research, some relevant background information and definitions that will make it easier to understand the paper, followed by the experiment setup and feature sets that were chosen to drive the experiment's findings. Then I'll be going over the results and its analysis, finally followed by a conclusion section. In this paper, the main objective is to evaluate the effectiveness of using eye movement biometrics as a novel defense against the lunchtime attack by an insider threat. An insider threat in this context refers to a person with physical access to a workstation that he or she is not supposed to use. For example, using a coworker's workstation while the coworker is away for lunch or for a bathroom break. There are generally three main factors of authentication. Something you know, like a password, something you have, like a key card or an ID badge, and something you are, like a fingerprint or pupil information. In a controlled experiment, the authors tested how both time and task familiarity can influence eye movements biometrics and feature stability, and how different subsets of eye features can affect the classified performance. Once physical security is compromised, the eye movement biometrics, as described in this paper, can serve as a secondary defense in a layered security system. Usually, when physical security is compromised, you're already looking at a loss. Certain kinds of information, PII, classified information, or any other information that the insider is not supposed to have now has access or the ability to extract those kinds of information. As such, usually we prefer to have multiple authentication methods, two-factor authentication methods over a single authentication system, such as just knowing a password to log into your email system. The approach of the paper considers both users that are simply careless, for example, leaving his or her desk without locking the session during lunchtime, and users that are actively collaborating with the attacker by giving up information. The second case makes this attack notoriously difficult to defend against. The human eye offers a rich feature space based on voluntary, involuntary, and reflexive eye movements. The experimental design captures the unique characteristics of each user's eye movements as measured by an eye tracker, and we will go in more detail as we progress through the presentation. The research also considers ways in which the attacker could use his or her position to gain inside information about the user and the system through observation or social engineering, such as shoulder surfing. In particular, there are three scenarios that the paper considered for an insider. Scenario A, when this insider has no prior knowledge and no information advantage prior to accessing a system. Scenario B, insider has knowledge gained through a description, or the adversary is provided with a textual description by a colluding legitimate user. And finally, scenario C, where the insider has knowledge gained through observation by looking over the shoulder of a legitimate user performing a task. Some background information and definitions here. The human visual system has some pretty cool features that allows us as humans to see and understand. Specifically, the connections between the retina and the brain regions are responsible for generating eye movements. We will focus on the fixational eye movements, which are typical for working with a desktop machine and processing static stimuli shown on display or monitor. Examples can include reading documents, navigating through file directories, or looking through this slide deck of this presentation. There are 6 degrees of freedom with 6 muscles that are generally responsible for eye movements. The main types of eye movements are called saccades and fixations. These are used in perceiving a stationary object or scene or reading a document. As seen in the slide, we have two figures. Um, Figure 1 on the left, it shows a simplified example of gaze tracking with different types of uh, eye movements. Saccades are rapid stepwise movements of both eyes in the same direction, usually lasting about 10 to 100 microseconds. Fixations last longer and relatively focused, and they last longer and they last between 100 to 400 microseconds. We can see the saccades are more oval shaped, whereas fixations are almost coin shaped and almost circular. Fixations are used to stabilize the retina over a stationary object of interest, yet our eyes are never perfectly still. They continue to make involuntary movements even during visual fixations. The main reason for such movements is to counteract the retinal fatigue and eye fatigue and to prevent visual fading. For example, if a person attempts to fixate on an image or an object by strongly focusing on a single point, the image would start to fade away and the visual image would just become blank. And we can attest to that by, usually just gazing at a at a boring lecture or something that's really of no interest to you, and just your visual image sort of fades out and you simply kind of black out. On figure 2 on the right, we have a simplified example of gaze tracking. The raw gaze samples are collected by the eye tracking device and subsequently clustered into fixations, saccades, and microsaccades. Conventionally, the studies of fixational eye movements have been considered with medical diagnosis such as Alzheimer's and schizophrenia. With an advance in eye tracking technologies, analyzing eye movements has proven to be valuable in not only in healthcare but in many other areas such as marketing, um, for analyzing visual attention, um, to sort of test the measure of an effective advertising, human computer interface design, pilot training, detecting fatigue and drowsiness in drivers, etc., etc. If eye positions are calibrated with respect to an external display, then the process is called gaze tracking. There are many types of eye tracking techniques, with the main trade-off between temporal and spatial accuracy versus intrusiveness and usability. Traditionally, eye tracking techniques require either a head-mounted device or electrodes attached to the subject's face. One such example is the electroculography, or EOG, which is a technique for recording eye movements by measuring electric potential at the electrodes placed around the eyes. While this technique can be used to capture the eye movements even during sleep to monitor REM sleep, its main disadvantage is the high intrusiveness, since the electrodes must be attached to the person's face. Recently, there has been significant progress in eye tracking technology driven by its importance in many commercial scenarios, such as advertising, marketing, and usability studies. The gaming and entertainment industries also show a trend towards consumer level eye tracking devices, not only as an additional control channel, but also to enhance our computer human interaction. The most widely used eye tracking technology today is video based. Video based eye tracking uses a video camera which focuses on the pupils and records their movements and size. To improve the tracking accuracy, these devices usually use a source of controlled infrared or near infrared light to create a distinctive reflection patterns. And we can see figure 3 as an example. Importantly, the current video-based eye tracking is non-invasive and remote, operating without any contact with the subject. The required hardware is only a standard webcam capable of recording infrared light, which is what the authors of this research paper used. Again, the adversarial model considered in this paper focuses on insider threats. Besides the lunchtime attack performed by an insider, other examples include cleaning staff gaining access to workstations after hours, or the trivial case where an employee simply allows another employee to use his or her station or access credentials. In all of these scenarios, an adversary might gain access to a fully operational system already logged into a privileged account and with access to everything that the legitimate user of the workstation would normally have access to. Any subsequent attack mounted from such a compromised workstation can be hard to trace back to the actual real attacker. In this model, the adversary is aware of the gaze tracking system and will do his or her best to imitate the behavior of the legitimate user. This can be done by familiarizing himself with the system before sitting down at the terminal, thus trying to appear to the gaze tracking system as an experienced user. From the attacker's perspective, there are two incentives to obtain this kind of information. One, if he manages to observe how the user accesses sensitive data or performs some sort of transaction, he will most likely be able to carry out his attack much faster, helping him to avoid detection. Besides this, performing a task in a similar way may result in ocular characteristics being closer to the legitimate user. The adversary will win if he can circumvent the gaze tracking system, uh, i.e., exhibiting ocular characteristics that are similar enough to the legitimate user. We will consider two models of knowledge transfer to help the adversary familiarize himself with the system. One, the adversary will gain knowledge about the system by reading or being told how the system works. And two, the adversary will see, i.e., by shoulder surfing, how a legitimate user operates the system. In order to make the authentication system usable in a standard working environment, the calculation of the features must only use raw eye tracking data without relying or controlling the stimuli. It's important to know which degree features are influenced by the task the user performs while the features are collected. As eye movements are always a reaction to a stimulus, perfect task independence can never be guaranteed, but some features are more susceptible to such influence than others, and largely task independent features allow conducting the training phase with a task different to the one performed during the system's actual operation. This is particularly desirable in an office environment, as a wide variety of tasks are performed on a daily basis. A high degree of task independence will significantly reduce the error rates exhibited by the system. In this slide, we have table 1, all 21 features. The features are divided into three groups: the pupil features, temporal features, and spatial features. And for each feature, we report the relative mutual information, or RMI, with the user ID. A value of 0 indicates that the feature carries no information about the user ID, while a value of 1 means that the feature completely defines the user ID. For each feature, we report whether it is included in the full feature set, reduced feature set, or without pupil feature set. High RMI indicates the feature is distinctive, but it's important to consider the correlation between the features as well as when choosing a feature set. Additionally, several features that are not particularly distinctive on their own may be more useful when combined. And in here we also have definitions for entropy, and let's move on to the next slide, which shows the correlation measured by the Pearson correlation coefficient. And these are all all the 21 features are included in this diagram. Next slide. We define a specific set of tasks that all users must complete in the experiment design. The goal is to determine whether the user's eye movements are distinguishable, even if they're completing the same task the same way with the same knowledge. If this is indeed the case, that means there are inherent differences between the users that can be attributed to different ways of completing a single task. Figure 6a and 6b visually shows the experiment structure. Each session is divided into 3 experiments, and each of which is repeated a number of times. And the entire session is repeated 2 weeks, repeated after 2 weeks, and again an hour after the second repetition. On experiment 1, the insider has no prior knowledge, and no instructions are given to the test subjects beyond asking them to click the dots as fast as possible. The short version has 5 dots, and the long version has 7 dots. The idea behind experiment 1 is to model a scenario in which an insider sits down at a workstation without prior knowledge of the task of the task he is facing. We assume that the subject's performance is affected by increasing task familiarity as well as memory-based learning effects when he completes the same sequence of dots multiple times. These effects reflect those observed in real environments when users become accustomed to their typical working environment. In experiment 2, we have some knowledge provided via description beforehand. The screen is divided into 6 areas, number 1 through 6, and the positions of the dots in the sequence is given in terms of a sequence of numbers that correspond to the area. And in experiment 3, the subject gains knowledge through observation or a visual representation of the exact dot position before the dot sequence is shown. So in figure 6b, we also have the setup, which consists of an SMI Red 500 gaze tracker that determines the user's gaze position on a 24-inch screen with 1920 x 1200 resolution. In this slide, we have the gaze position and mouse position with respect to time. And at time t0, a new dot appears followed by a period of inactivity, which is the reaction time, in which neither the gaze nor the cursor move significantly. After about 150 milliseconds, at t1, a visual reaction in the form of a large saccade occurs. We can see that on the gray area, and the gaze and cursor converges to the position of the stimulus, which is the dot. Next slide. We also have the metrics and results of our experiment setup. In order to measure task performance, there are 3 metrics that one needs to know. Task completion time, which is the time it takes a test subject to complete one sequence of the experiment. Gaze distance, the distance between a subject's gaze position and the position of the stimulus, which is the dot, right before it is displayed. And 3, the cursor distance, which is the distance between the cursor location and the position of the stimulus right before it is displayed. In these 3 charts, we see that the researchers and authors did not perform repetitions with identical sequences for experiment 2 and experiment 3, but these results generally show that the average overall, as repetitions go up, the average performance for experiment 1 improves, and the 2 knowledge transfer mechanisms cause the subjects to perform similarly or slightly even better through several repetitions of natural learning. We can therefore conclude that our test subjects they do benefit from information in the same way that an attacker might. And so the results, they use machine learning algorithms to classify the results, and 2 performance metrics are defined here: the equal error rate, and the minimum and maximum class distance, and the KNN, or the K nearest neighbor, and support vector machine algorithms are used, again, as I said, to classify the results. The equal error rate is the rate at which the false accept rate and the false reject rate are equal, and is a good measure to compare different classifiers. The class distance measures the distance between the template of a user and the most successful out of the 29 imposters and gives insight about the distribution of false classifications. Um, as we see, as we'll be seeing in the next slide, a class distance lower than 1 means that the best attacker is more likely to be accepted than the legitimate user, and a high class distance means that the user is harder to impersonate. And here, increasing the number of samples to 40 rapidly decreases the equal error rate. After that, there are diminishing returns. If the quick detection of an imposter is important, the smallest number that still yields acceptable error rate should be chosen. So whether you use the full feature set or reduced feature set or the without pupil diameter, one should just really consider the standard and the trade-off between accuracy versus performance. Using the sampling rate of 4 Hertz, even the highest number of 180 samples will correspond to only 45 seconds. In the following slide, it shows that most attackers can be detected even before the 45-second mark, as the number of attackers samples in the sliding window gradually increases. While most attacks are detected quickly, 92% within 40 seconds, the system fails to detect 2.76 of attackers within the scope of the data, which means that the system exhibits systematic false negatives. These false negatives occur when the biometric templates of 2 users are very close. And to discuss more about the results, as I mentioned earlier, we can compare each of the 3 classified feature sets with the equal error rate and the classified class distance, minimal and maximal class distance. In this, I'm going to wrap up this presentation with a conclusion. The research shows that the authors worked with a set of 21 distinct discriminative features based on a person's eye movement patterns. The usefulness of these features is not limited to the design. They can be used with a wide set of general tasks like web browsing, writing emails, or writing a letter. The research and the experiment designed a controlled experiment that accounts for different ways an inside attacker can obtain information from a naive or colluding user to aid in impersonation attacks. Using gaze tracking data from the experiments, we quantify the advantage an adversary has in impersonating a user and test if the adversary has obtained knowledge about the task the user normally performs. The data collected during the experiments comes from 30 members of the general public, and the data shows that eye movements provide a rich source of distinguishing information. And the data from the single session provided an equal error rate of less than 4%, and while the effects of task familiarity are measurable, it does not allow the attacker to circumvent an authentication system based on eye movements and gaze trackings. In order to test the time stability of the features, the researchers performed 2 repetitions of the experiments 2 weeks apart, and the results were still consistent, and they were able to, the users were able to authenticate reliably over the entire period. All in all, the nature of eye movements and the low error rates makes eye movements an excellent biometric, and it can also be used to build other continuous authentication mechanisms. And as we know, users are usually the weakest link, and this also applies to cyber physical systems. And hopefully we can detect, prevent insider threats by implementing these sorts of authentication systems. If you have any questions, I'm looking forward to them via on the Piazza questions and the forums. And thank you for listening.